What is the good word? I have with me today a guy, when he graduated college, even says he could not sell himself out of a wet paper bag. And I just love that expression coming from the Northeast that I don't hear that often anymore, but that was definitely an expression we used. And I'm not sure how you sell yourself out of a wet paper bag, but this guy has definitely done it. He's been in sales for over 3 decades, but he's still miraculously only 42 years old. That is Bill Gager. So, Bill, welcome to the Sales Made Easy podcast.
Harry, thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to talking with you this morning. Thank you.
Oh man, I love talking about sales. So, Bill, why don't you tell us what you've been up to for the past 30 years when you got out of college and you couldn't sell out of a wet paper bag? What did you end up doing?
Well, it's funny because it kind of led me down a path that I wanted to go into when I was in college, which was psychology. I was always fascinated by human nature. And when I got into sales, it really became important to me because I tried to sell logically. I would
Hmm.
go meet with somebody, they would logically relay their need to me. I would logically explain how my product at the time I was selling packaging equipment would fit that need and solve the problem. And then they wouldn't do anything. Even though they told me they needed something, even though they acknowledged, yes, what you have will work for me. Very often, not, I mean, I was a successful salesperson, so I closed
Sure.
deals, but there were a lot of deals that I thought should have been closed that didn't. And I wanted to understand why. And so that took me down a 30-year path of trying to understand what really makes human beings tick, especially when it comes down to making buying decisions. And in reality, it's really about making decisions to change because the same psychology that we go through and we decide to give up smoking or word to start working out is the same psychology we go through when we decide to buy a product or service. And so I was fascinated by that and wanted to understand what makes people tick.
Oh man, that is so much to use the proverbial unpack line. So I'm not going to use unpack, but you said a lot of interesting things there about the psychology of change, right? Selling logically.
Yeah.
And you also said that you were fairly successful in sales. Can you just give a little background as to what you did so I better
Yeah.
understand where we could go and so forth? Yeah.
Yeah. So when I got out of college, it was not a great time. I was competing in sales jobs against attorneys, and there just wasn't a lot available. So I happened to take a job um, working for a defense contractor as a marketing analyst. And
Okay.
I had no interest in being in sales at the time. I had that same attitude towards salespeople that unfortunately a lot of people have. And I seem to have this thing in my life that the minute I say I'm never going to do something, I end up doing it a lot. And I swore I'd never be a salesperson. And I've been in sales, as you said, for over 3 decades. And so one day we got a call from another defense contractor. They wanted to investigate hiring us to do some work for them. And my boss said, go meet with them. Well, I met with them, closed the deal, and I was hooked. And
Hmm.
that began a career of leaving the defense contractor, getting into packaging sales. I started off my rookie year for the first large company I worked for, a company called Matthews International. We sold inkjet printing equipment out of Pittsburgh,
Oh,
PA. My rookie year, I came in third overall nationwide. Didn't expect to be there. Was
yeah.
the youngest sales manager in the history of a 150-year-old company, the
Wow.
youngest general manager. And during that time, my company and other companies weren't investing a lot in training. So I
Hmm.
started building training programs for my people, and that got me hooked on the sales training and the leadership training bug. And I jumped fully into that back in the mid 90s.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So, just out of curiosity, what motivated you to do that? Because typically, when I hear of sales, the stereotypical salesperson, which obviously you were fighting against, but most of them, many, are self serving, only thinking about themselves, are not necessarily thinking about developing a team.
Right.
What really motivated you in that regards?
I think it came back to that fascination with human nature and beginning to understand how it really works. And the thing is, when I find something out that I think is really interesting and not well known, is I want to tell everybody. And that's a strength and a weakness, right? Depending on how hard I push it. But I just wanted to share because to me, it was like finally understanding something that had plagued me for a long time. And I just wanted to share it with my team and with anybody who would listen.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so we're going to go back to your original comments. You talked about change,
Yeah,
um, and that one, such an interesting topic because people look inward, like entrepreneurs, especially, they don't think they're a good salesperson. They think
right.
they're missing something. And talk to me about the change. What did you learn or discover through that process?
Well, it really comes down to, sales. We think of it as all too often as we've got to go out and make a sale. We think of
Hmm.
it from our perspective as the salesperson. But when you look at it from a buyer's perspective, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get them to make a change. So if they're buying janitorial supplies from XYZ company and you sell janitorial supplies from ABC company, you're trying to get them to change from XYZ company to ABC company. If somebody, in my case, I sold bagging equipment. If
Hmm.
somebody was packaging their product into a plastic bag by hand, I was trying to get them to change to do it automatically through a machine.
Hmm.
So sales, no matter what that sale is, whether I've worked in all kinds of industries from wealth management, investment banking, all the way down to manufacturer sales, to commodity sales, all of that. But it all involves the buyer making a change. And there's a lot of psychology around that. And it's not widely known because my experience is when we talk about change, we tend to oversimplify it. And in reality, from a psychological perspective, it's one of the hardest things to get human beings to do.
I, yeah, I mean, I'm just giggling because this is just so great. I mean, I think there's this thing called change management, right? Because
Exactly.
change is freaking difficult, right? So people, I mean, so going into a sales training, right, where
Yeah.
you're hired to train salespeople, and this is why training fails miserably,
Miserably.
right?
As two training guys talked about.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
And it's because there's no change management. As soon as the sales training leaves the trainer leaves after whatever. It's a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever.
10
What do
years, right?
people do?
Exactly.
What do they
They
do?
revert.
They go back. Yeah, I'm going to go back to what I'm comfortable with because this is nonsense. I hate doing all the stuff he says. That's not me.
Exactly.
Right. So that's just in sales training. So then if we think about all the things, how about this one? I'm a married guy. For years, when my wife moved the furniture, I'd look at it and it's like, wow, what are you
Yeah, who
doing?
moved my
But
cheese, right?
it's just I can't look at the window from this angle. The TV, no, I can't do it. Was
Exactly.
change. Right? My
Exactly.
wife would just say, get over it. And eventually I learned, but I realized that I had to make, even that in a simple thing as moving a piece of furniture, change is not easy for everybody. So, with
Exactly.
that setup, talk to me.
So one of the greatest synchronicities that's happened in my career, I was back in the 90s, I was head of sales training for a large regional bank called Bank Boston. And we were getting bought out by Fleet Bank.
Mhm.
And so the director of training there was really unique. She was not your normal training director. Her focus was not on training, it was on performance development. And she had us all read the book Performance Management. And really, I learned a lot about how to go in and really work with clients to not just propose training, but to really help them solve problems. And
Mhm.
she came across this guy by the name of Bill Bridges. And his whole thing was too much of the focus in change is on change management, which is managing the process. He said, very few, if anybody, looks at the human side of change. And that is the psychological, emotional process a person goes through if they are actually going to make the change that we're trying to manage. And he called that transition. So he said, change is the event, transition is the human process. And so his whole focus was he developed a model for a transition process that we all have to go through if we're going to adopt a change. Not that it's mandated, but that's the psychological way we handle it. And he talked about the first step before anybody makes a change is they've got to come to terms with and really buy into that the old way is over. And he called that step the ending piece because a lot of times your experience, my experience of dealing with salespeople, they have a methodology they've been using.
Mm-hmm.
And that methodology may not be as successful as they want it to be. But the reality is, it's probably brought them success at least once.
Yeah.
And so they know that that way has made it work at least once. And so now here comes this guy, Bill Gager, who says, leave that way behind and do it this way. Well, the reality is they don't want to let go of that old way because the way I'm proposing has worked for them 0 times because they haven't even tried it yet.
Right.
Their ways worked for them at least once. So the first step is to get them to really buy into that the old way has got to go. And if you don't take that step first, doesn't matter what you present to them, they're always going to hang on to that. And that's what Bill Bridges' philosophy was, that if you don't get people to actually come to terms that the old way is ending, they'll never move forward. And the reality is, those lack of endings build. So I was dealing with people who'd been through 3 and 4 mergers. And what we discovered was in this trying to get people to change process is they weren't over the merger 4 mergers ago. They were still holding on to that old way. And so there's this, to use your term, there's a series of unpackings that have to happen to set people up to be successful in adopting change. And understanding that process is critical for leaders, for salespeople, for anybody who needs to influence somebody else to make a change.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a simple person, and this sounds like there's a ton of research and studying that goes behind this.
There is.
So I'm an entrepreneur. I'm
Yep.
selling a widget or I'm selling a service,
Yeah.
right? So how does all of this help me? Because I'm not thinking about this change
That's
management
right.
thing, right? So how can I simplify and start selling better by, adopting some of this somehow? What's your thought?
The simplest way is to find out what is that decision maker's priorities. What matters most to them? Is it growing their business? Is it getting their bonus depending on who you're dealing with? Get them, and here's where it's not as simple as going, Harry, what's important to you? Because if you don't have enough of a connection there, that you're not going
Right.
to get the truth. But the reality is, as a salesperson, what I find the most important thing we can do to dramatically increase our results is to focus first on finding out on what are the top 3, if they have them, priorities for that buyer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the piece people misstep on, is very often, if I find out your priorities, I redefine your priorities into my terms. One of them, they always say there's no magic bullet. Well, there is a magic bullet, or pretty close to a magic bullet in sales. And that is finding out what is the language that the decision maker uses to describe what matters most to them. Because those specific words carry a tremendous amount of emotional connection. And what I call these are motivation keys. They're words or phrases that somebody uses to describe something that has a lot of emotional content. And emotional content equals motivation. And if you want people to change, you need to tap into their motivation to change. That motivation to change comes back to tapping into what they are emotionally connected to. So an
Yeah.
example of this is, years ago, I was meeting with the president of a wealth management firm. And I got, we did, I established the connection. We started the conversation, and I started asking him, Bob, as you look to the next year, what's your number one priority? And he says, I got to get to 85 million in new business. And he must have said, got to get to 85 million in new business 50 times in the next 30 minutes. Now that tells me that phrase means something to him, So when I came back with my written proposal and then I did my presentation, everything I talked about, I framed as, so you get to 85 million in new business next year. Here's what we can do. So that you get to 85 million in new business next year, here's what's going to happen. And I kept linking everything that I was proposing back to his motivation key. And in my experience, nothing is foolproof because there's a part of the brain that actually its job is to prevent us from changing. But as salespeople, if we're going to be change agents and help our customers make the changes that are going to benefit them, in my experience, the most powerful thing we can do is use the language they use to describe what matters most to
This is a work of art, ladies and gentlemen.
them.
I'm loving this. So, like, I'm 100% on board with this. So if I go on when I go out on a sales call, I'm taking a pen and a pad,
Absolutely.
right? When I hear those phrases, I'm not going to remember just on the basis of my memory. If I'm talking to someone, having a conversation for 30 or 45 minutes, I'm finding out very general things about their buying process,
Yes,
what's important to them. But the devil I hear is in the details.
exactly.
Right. So when people come back, so I've been managing salespeople for
Right,
years. What's really important to them? Oh, it's price. Right?
right,
Right?
right,
It's price. It always comes down to price, or maybe once in a while they say service. But it's
right.
generally one of those two things, right? The 90-10, probably 90% price. But there's some opening up that person to have a conversation and say, why is it about price? What's happened? Or why is it about service? What's happened? And when you get that story,
Right.
what do you do with it? Right? So, what do you do when you get that story?
So one of the things I find is salespeople don't take a broad enough approach. We feel like we're under pressure to close a deal. So a lot of salespeople will go in and start off the needs assessment by focusing on the potential needs for their product or service.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm selling accounting software, I could go into the I'll go into the CFO, and if I'm not one of the 90% of software salespeople who goes right into a demo, and I'm actually going to ask some needs assessment, it's usually going to be around. Tell me a little bit about your accounting process. To me, that's too narrow, because if I'm a decision maker, the underlying motivations that really drive me very rarely have to do specifically with the product or service that I'm going to be buying. My underlying true motivators have to do with the bigger picture, my business, my career, my world. And so I don't care what I'm selling. If I'm going in there, I'm going to find out first, how does that decision maker define her or his world? So if it's the head of HR, I want to hear about the world of HR, not the specific aspect of employee control software that I'm going to be selling.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I take that broader approach, that's where I get into the underlying big motivators. And the other thing is, because I'm not so if I go into a CFO and I'm selling accounting software and I start off with, talk to me about your accounting process,
Mm-hmm.
there's a gatekeeper in the mind of that CFO that knows, okay, he's trying to sell me accounting software. But
Right.
if I go in and say, tell me about your business, tell me about what your vision is for your operation over the next year, it takes that gatekeeper out of the defending against salesperson mode, and they begin to open up and have a conversation. Then, as a salesperson, as a sales professional, my job is to build the conversational momentum, because salespeople tend to want to go down too quick and try and get a need so they can go put a proposal together and see if they can close the deal. And the reality is they're shooting themselves in the foot 95% of the time. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, and not only does it make sense, I love it. So these are things I've been talking about for screaming till I'm blue in the face. Not screaming,
Mm-hmm.
but So like a lot of people just don't have the patience for that, right? So
Exactly.
they get to the point where they say, okay, you just said something about accounting. So I'm going to tell you, that's it. I don't care about all the other things you said about your business, about your hopes, dreams, goals. You know, the stuff that's really important to you, you hit a word that triggered me to start going down the sales mode. And that's where, I mean, it's not like you cannot be successful doing that,
Yes.
but you have just gone from that point where you said there's a gatekeeper mindset where people, the buyers, and again, I'm not done. You tell me if I'm wrong. So the buyer is thinking all along when a salesperson is in front of them or an entrepreneur who is is selling, they're saying, when is this person going to start being the salesperson?
Yes.
Right? When are they going to start turning me off? When are they going to start being self-serving? And where is this, the fake roadshow where they actually
Right.
show they're a little bit interested, but they're
Right.
really not. It's just to get me to open up, but then they really just want to go back to their pitch. So this is all going on in the back of their mind. And if you don't
Right.
believe me, listen to your own thinking the
Oh,
next time,
absolutely.
right? You buy
Absolutely.
something of significance. Look how skeptical you are. So now you've got this skeptical mode. People are bringing you down this. You're now opening up and saying, Jesus, Bill Gager really seems to be interested in me. I'm going to tell him. And then if I say something and you say, well, that reminds me, that's why I'm here today, is to
Right.
sell you stuff. What does it do to that buyer? What does it do to the whole experience?
You shoot yourself right in the foot. And here's the thing, you bring up a really good point, Harry. You can't fake this. You can't go in and say, I'm going to act interested so that I get them to say the thing so I can pounce. Because the reality is, we all have a built in bullshit detector.
Yeah.
We don't always listen to it, but we all have a built in detector that knows when somebody's being disingenuous. So part of this process is your intention has to be to really want to get to know this person and get to know what their world is and to really want to help. And this is something I talk to a lot with salespeople and managers that I work with. If your intention is to sell, they're going to smell it on you a mile away. If
Mm-hmm.
your intention is to go in there to see if you can help, that's going to set up a very different psychological dynamic. Because if your intention truly is, hey, I'm coming in here to see if I can help. If I can, great. If I can't, no worries. And then have a conversation that puts that intention into practice, that internal gatekeeper knows and feels the sincerity of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is so critical to everything that we do, whether, you know, I'm a leader trying to convince my team about something, or I'm a salesperson trying to convince a customer about something. If my intention is to serve my own needs at the cost of the other person, they're going to know it at some level.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's just greatness here in this conversation. The things that a lot of people get in sales for early on is the money, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe right. That is the original thing. Is it's the money. If it just stays as the money, though, when you're out impacting other people's business and therefore their lives, their work life, which is part of their life, and you don't make that connection, then don't be surprised when people start ghosting you, right?
Exactly.
Right? Because people are not seeing you as a consultant, someone that
That's right.
actually cares. Is that right?
That's
Do
right.
I have that right?
Absolutely. They feel it.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So much of our what we talk about and what we learn is, about what people think. And the reality is nothing happens from thought. It all happens from feeling. And people have an inner sense and they're going to feel where you're coming from. They may not pay attention to it, but in a sales situation, they very often do, because don't forget, their mind is already predisposed to not making the change you're trying to get them to make. And so, what that part of the brain's actually doing is it's actually looking for excuses not to change. And if it can use your ill intent as one of those excuses, it certainly will.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny. having been around salespeople for a while, right? You've probably heard it from as well, where a salesperson, or even again business owners, we
Yes.
all can say the same thing. We
Yes.
can say about a prospect where we want to sell something, and we can say this person's a real jerk.
Right.
And they right, so they go in with this mindset thinking that they can somehow hide that feeling,
Right. Right.
right? Can you tell me why I'm just curious if you know why you can't hide that. I have an idea on layman's terms, but what do you think on that as far as why you can't hide that?
Well, now we're getting a little woo woo, Harry.
Okay,
Because
all right, okay. I don't want to go too woo woo. Wherever you want to go, be comfortable with your answer.
okay, so it's woo woo, but it's actually been scientifically proven. We all have an
Okay.
electromagnetic field we give off,
Yeah.
and it radiates out from us so many feet. And you ever notice when you meet somebody, you walk up, somebody walks up to you at a party, or somebody within about a split second, you without them even opening your mouth, you kind of get a feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we make a judgment, and that
Yeah.
judgment is off of, and again, it sounds woo woo, but it's been
Yeah. Yeah.
proven scientifically off of
Yeah.
their magnetic field. Emotion impacts that magnetic field. If you've got, negative emotions, that magnetic field is actually of a lower frequency. This isn't BS,
Yeah.
scientifically proven. If you have good emotions, that magnetic field is of a higher frequency. Our inner BS detector, our security system.
Now
our
that's
radar system.
scientific. Our
Yeah.
inner BS detector. Very.
That's actually-
No, I was buying into what you said until you went into. Oh no, I'm just kidding. It's all.
Like that feeling. Yeah,
I get
know,
it.
I know.
Yeah. No, it's
No, I
good.
love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It senses that. And so if my energy field is like, I hate you, I think you're a jerk, but I'm going, hey Harry, nice to meet you. It's like the words don't match.
They don't. They don't match.
And the feeling
yeah.
wins out every time.
Yeah, and you can't hide the body language.
No.
Right? So when you're warm and receptive and loving on somebody versus you're going to try to fake that, it's too different. It's like, oh, you're not my favorite aunt, but I'm going to give you a hug and I'm going to cringe.
Exactly.
My face is going to make a different expression.
Exactly.
My eyes may roll. I'm not going to look directly in the eyes. I might, there's just things about, and you cannot fake everything, right?
That's right.
So
That's right.
the whole thing is that, so now you've got this, and it happens. We don't necessarily connect with everybody,
Right.
but someone may be a good prospect. And I know this is not the direction we were probably thinking about going,
Okay.
but the whole thing about if you think someone's a jerk, what can you do when you're thinking like this to try to help you to say, look, I'm not going to, I have almost a 0% chance of winning anything here if I think the person's a jerk, right? It's super low because the whole thing, people like to buy from people they like and blah,
Right.
blah, blah, right?
Right.
If they think you think they're a jerk, they're probably, there's a good chance they're not buying from you, right?
Exactly.
So what can we do when we have this, man, I'm just not connecting here. What can we do?
I think there's two sides to this, because I do think there are some prospects we come across that, the old saying, there's some business you don't want.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you do come across a prospect that is so taking and going to beat you up so badly that it really doesn't make sense to do business with them, because the cost of doing business with them far outweighs the benefit.
Yeah.
The other side of it is, so I really need to look at, why do I feel this way about this person? Because here's one of the things that I live by. If something in somebody else bothers me, it's usually because I'm not owning it myself. So if I think somebody's a little obnoxious, I'm not owning my own obnoxiousness. And so a lot of times and this wasn't the way I was for a long time, this came to me in the last 20 years as I've gone into a lot more personal growth, is an understanding that if somebody triggers me, they're reflecting back to me something I need to own. And that's something that I pay a close attention to. And what I find is, when I realize, hey, the reason this guy Bob is rubbing me the wrong way is because he's showing a part of me that I don't like. And if I can own that in me, a lot of times that animosity towards the other person just goes away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It just goes away. It's not
Yeah.
easy. It's
No.
not, it's simple,
Right.
but it's not easy.
Yeah. One of the things I look at is that we're all little kids,
Yep.
right? So I mean, this has helped me over the years is that I don't look at people as adults in their 40s or 50s or 60s. I look at them as kids who are 8, 10 years old.
It's pretty accurate.
Right? Where and the reason I do that is it just puts us on the literally it puts us on the playing field, right? The
Yeah, right,
playground,
right,
right?
exactly.
And it's amazing when you see people as a kid and how different they look and how different they act. Now, again, I have not always done this, and still to this
Right.
day, someone, surprises me. I'm not looking I mean, I want to smack them, right? It's like,
Yeah, right,
fire comes up and but
right.
when things are calm and I see a difference, I try to reflect and I say, that was a kid one time, and that kid liked to play football or she liked to dance or play in the swing sets. And it's just like you see the inner kid there
Right.
somehow. And it just becomes much more, I don't know, easier to like people. Because I
Yeah.
mean, if you like kids, maybe I don't know what the
Right,
psychological
right,
reason
right.
is for that, but it's just something that's helped me. And I remember, you know, over the past several years, I had
Right.
a conflict with a person, and the conflict went away once I started looking at the person as a child and not as an adult that had issues. The
Right.
child with inexperience that just
Right.
wants to be liked, right, and have friends.
Right.
That's a whole lot easier to get around, and we kind of let go of not their hangups, right? As you
Right.
said, it's
Right.
our own,
Right.
right? And that's, I
Exactly.
mean, I love what you said. So, like, if you think someone is not trustworthy, if your radar goes up and says, well, they're not trustworthy before you even know them, they're shady, you got to look in the mirror,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah. And
Absolutely.
that's a sense of awareness, which again, whole
Yes.
nother conversation. Very
Yes.
difficult to teach that,
It is.
right?
It is
So
difficult to teach.
so when someone were to say that and say, well, that buyer is just a jerk, do you kind of go down the path that you tell the story about how you were and, you're acknowledging that you kind of had to self reflect and look in the mirror a bit?
Yeah. Yeah. But like you said, that's a tough one because
Hmm.
unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to take that responsibility on. A lot of people don't want to own their own stuff and they want to remain. And like you said, this could be a whole other series of podcasts, right? But
Yeah.
it's that victimhood thing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if you choose to be a victim in life, you look at things very, very differently than if you choose. I had a mentor back in
Mm.
the started back in 2003, a very amazing mentor. One of the first things he said to me was, Bill, you got to understand that everything in your life that comes at you is of you. It's not that you're to blame for it, but you're responsible for it. And so if somebody does something to you, yeah, they've got their piece of it, but you have to own that you brought that to yourself for a reason. And when I realized that and bought into that, as opposed to saying, well, gee, Harry's done this to me or Harry did that to me, and I go into victim mode, it changes everything. Once you have that fundamental shift of taking responsibility for your life, in my experience, everything else changes. And this is true of salespeople, leaders, entrepreneurs. The whole dynamic of your business will change dramatically.
Yeah. That's powerful stuff. So, all right. So now that we've gotten this, I'm on the coach of the therapist. I'm on the couch of the therapist here. This has been great. So I'm going to go back to the other thing that you said was sometimes you just have to make a judgment.
Yes.
And if you don't want to go down the path and figure out, maybe you got to look in the mirror and that you're not in sync with a particular buyer, sometimes you just have to cut the cord. Is that
That's right.
necessarily a bad thing?
No, I think, it goes back to that. I find old sayings are old sayings for a reason. And, one of the old sayings is there's just some business you don't want. And I know when I've gone against that, I've regretted it. It just ended up being too much of a cost. And, I think it comes back to what you were saying about that discernment. Because sometimes, if somebody comes to you and you get a gut feeling that they're not trustworthy, they're not.
Hmm.
you know they're not trustworthy, and that's a reality. So there's the owning your piece of it, but as a sales professional, as a leader, we're reliant on other people. So we have to develop our ability to discern what's going on there. And the
Yeah.
way I found to do that is pay attention to how you feel about that person. I talk about this with interviews. you know Sales managers and sales directors will talk about interviews, and they'll be like, well, I asked this question, I asked that question, I'm looking for this background, I throw this test at them. And I always say, well, okay, but how about this? The second they walk into the room, how did they feel? Did they feel like somebody you wanted to talk to, or did they feel like somebody you want to get away from? Because so often, especially when I was doing a lot of new hire training, I would deal with some salespeople, and I'd meet a salesperson. I'm like, why was this person ever hired? I'm sure they're a nice person, but my instant reaction to them is I just don't want to be near them.
Hmm.
And we've got to pay attention to that gut. We don't necessarily want to react off of it, but it has to be a part of our discerning process that we factor in to help us make the right choices.
Yeah, it's definitely true. So it's not just a great resume. It's not just
Right.
a great, psychological test. It's not the ink blots. It's
Yeah.
right. And it's the conversation. You know, yeah. There. That again. That's another great topic. Yeah. This is really good stuff, and I know we could go on for a long time here,
Yeah.
and I want to.
Sure.
So just to kind of wrap up here. So
Yeah.
again, we're going to try to make this easy for people. What are a couple things that we can gain out of the fact that I'm going to go back to the change management? You're selling a product. You're talking about, the bigger picture of things and trying to gain some trust. You still have to deal with the change, right?
Yes.
So how do you coach a seller to help their buyer acknowledge that you understand there's change, if that's not too long of a question?
It's not. And it goes back to what I said about understanding the words they use to describe what matters most to them. Because whenever I can tap into that motivation key, that phrase, that key word that the buyer, the decision maker uses to describe what motivates them, every time I reconnect by using that phrase, I reconnect to that motivation. And the reality is, people will change when they have enough motivation to change. Now, what happens is people have motivation, but that motivation can lie dormant. And so I don't know if you've ever, I'm sure you've been in this situation. I'm sure the people watching the podcast have been in this situation. You're in front of a buyer, they're super motivated, they're ready to go. They're like, yeah, send me the proposal. We're going to do this. And then you never hear from them again. What
Never.
happens is, right. Well, yeah, it's never happened to you, only me.
Yeah.
What happens is the motivation was active while you were there, but for some reason it went dormant. And so part of, especially if you're in long sales cycles, part of your job as a salesperson is to keep tapping into and reactivating that motivation. And, if I could distill everything that we've talked about down to one thing, is discover the words that buyer uses to describe what matters most to them, and then use those words repeatedly in your conversations, your presentations, and your presentations and your proposals, and you will see a dramatic increase in success. Perfect example is a client of mine is a large technology provider. This one salesperson, she was consistently middle of the road. And she did that one change where all she started doing was, rather than focusing on selling the software, selling the services. She found out what mattered most and positioned her product or service in those terms. And she has consistently, for the last 3 years, been by far the number
Mm,
one salesperson in the
yeah.
company. I'm not talking by a little margin, I'm talking by far. And she works less hard than she ever did before.
Yeah. Because your chances of, I mean, before they might have been 1 out of 4, right? 1 out of 3. But any improvement on that, you're still seeing the same number of people potentially.
Exactly.
But if you improve your chances, then
Exactly.
that exponentially improves your
You
income
got
as
it.
well. So
You got it.
great stuff, Bill Gager. Yeah, you're definitely you provide a ton of value. Your
Thanks,
clients
Harry.
must love you. Where can people who are listening to you find you?
Simple. Bill Gager, GAGER.com. And if you go on my website, it'll link you to some videos. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Reach out and connect. And don't hesitate to reach out. Be happy to have a chat with you and see if any of the stuff I've been able to do for other sales professionals and leaders might help you. And if not, at least we have some fun and we both learn something.
And you may learn how to sell yourself out of a wet paper bag, at least, right?
Hopefully.
Oh man, this has been great. Thanks for coming on the Sales Made Easy podcast, man. Good stuff.
Thanks, Harry. It's been a real, real pleasure. I've enjoyed chatting with you this morning.
All right, great. Thank you.
Take care.